I think they are a good illustration of the combined use of hard and soft power. And as Nye would note, it's smart power. So a state doesn't necessarily have to use one strategy over the other. The combined use of hard and soft power is known as smart power. And the problem with only relying on hard power is you're coercing someone into doing something. And that goes back to this idea of winning friends, where to have enduring support, I think soft power is that factor.
That's a snippet of my conversation this week with Sara Greco. We talk about hard power and soft power and smart power, and how the alignment of these different forces is changing drastically in the world around us today. There is a clear erosion of U.S. diplomatic influence. The State Department is perhaps at its lowest capacity in a long, long time. And at the same time, there is an enormous churn, an immense change going on, whether the result of the presidency of Donald Trump or the autocrats in Hungary or Poland or Turkey, Vladimir Putin in Russia, and of course, as always, the inescapable rise of China. My name is Ben Charland. This is What on Earth is Going On, your weekly podcast for a world in flux. Now, we're going to dig into all of that in just a moment, but before we do, I wanted to, as I always do, ask you for a favor. If you like this show, please spread the word about it and keep the conversation going. You can go onto social media and look the show up. Just type in What on Earth is Going On. Find it on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. And there's the website, www.wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. At that website, you can find links to all previous episodes. All future episodes will be there as well. And at that website, you can reach out, leave a comment, tell me your suggestions for future episodes or what you think we should be tackling on this show. Now, when it comes to hard power and soft power, and of course smart power, it's a very difficult and nuanced conversation. I mean, if you think about it, what conversation is not difficult or nuanced, especially in the age that we're living in today? But it's important to note about hard power and soft power that they go together. And I think this is what Sara Greco is going to talk about in our conversation later about smart power. But what we're seeing is an erosion of hard power and a view that diplomacy and international politics, things like the UN, NAFTA, and NATO, that these are zero-sum games. That if they don't give you an immediate benefit or some kind of impact that you can sell to your citizens, well, then what's the point? The problem is that we've seen the underpinning of the world order for the last 70 years being based almost entirely on soft power, whether it's European or American or, yes, indeed, Canadian soft power. And as we talk about in the conversation coming up, soft power is your brand. It's your identity. Joseph Nye of Harvard University has explained that the best propaganda is not propaganda. It doesn't seem like propaganda. It's something that you already believe. And that soft power is the ability to shape the preferences of others. It's the ability to get things done without the use of carrots or sticks, without the use of coercion or payments. It's essentially something that other people already want. And this idea of soft power has really formed the backbone of international diplomacy, maybe forever, at least for certain, in the 20th century, leading up to the election of Donald Trump. And now this is someone who sees diplomacy as really being about one person, him. Having diplomats in another country doesn't really matter because it's all about the image and the relationships of Donald Trump, of the president. It's actually the exact way a monarchy would function. A monarchy being the relationships of one person at the top of a country defining that country, that a family, a royal family, defines the state. Louis XIV saying, "L'état c'est moi," I am the state. Donald Trump is essentially doing the same thing. But what are the ramifications of this? Is this the new normal? Is this just a blip on the radar? Is this just a bump on the road? It's hard to tell when you're in the present, when you're in the middle of it. But what we can see are actual statistical drops in American influence, both in what opinion polls say of people responding to the idea of American power, but also to the numbers in the U.S. State Department, which are in steep decline. The Trump administration has not been hiring people. They have not appointed ambassadors to countries like Korea, of all places, because they want that personal relationship to come to the fore. Now, this is a really prevalent discussion in American politics today, but it's also one that can be subsumed and essentially ignored in the face of all the other headlines. But what it means is that sooner or later, the Americans are not going to be able to stand toe-to-toe with the Chinese in countries, say, like Namibia or Zimbabwe or Tanzania, because the people there would rather be, frankly, on the other side. So what you might be getting with this zero-sum view of international affairs and relations is actually just a lot of short-term gains at the behest of the long term, at the behest of the long game. It's really hard to see, frankly, at the moment, the United States winning that long game. But of course, the populists, like Steve Bannon, would argue that they're winning the long game. They're changing the economic relationships. They're changing the foundations. They're reigniting American manufacturing. We don't see evidence of that yet, but that seems to be what they're trying to do. Time will only tell if it works. In any event, here's my conversation with Sara Greco, a doctoral candidate of political studies at Queen's University, an R.S. McLaughlin graduate fellow, and a student fellow at the Center for International and Defense Policy. I hope you enjoy it. All right, Sara Greco, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being on. It's a pleasure to have you. I am really excited to talk with you about foreign affairs, international relations, something that you've been doing a lot of work on in your PhD studies at Queen's University. Before we get to all of that, which I'm really, really stoked about, my first question, as always, is to you. Sara, what on earth is going on?
Right. Okay, so in the context, I think, of our discussion, what is going on is that we are seeing an erosion of American soft power. I think that the literature in international relations theory is very well established, talking about the utility and the importance of soft power. But I think what we're seeing really now is that this concept is no longer in that ivory tower in academia. It's something that we're seeing more empirically, and we're reporting on it more. I think we're seeing the importance of soft power in terms of how states are gaining influence, or perhaps in the context of the U.S., how they're losing influence. So for the United States, what we are seeing is the Trump administration focusing solely on hard power, right. And that's creating two issues. The first is that the U.S. is not tapping into its soft power capabilities, but also given the inconsistency that we are seeing within the United States, both domestically and internationally, that the U.S. no longer has that same amount of soft power.
So what is soft power and hard power?
Absolutely. Hard power is the material assets that a state can harness to coerce other states. So they can use those material assets, namely military, the economy, and technology, to force another state into doing something. And that can be by physically using those material assets, or simply by
the threat
of them. Okay. Exactly. And that's really what we're seeing Trump doing, whether it's in the context of NATO, with NAFTA, the WTO, the UN. I think there are plenty of examples to show that his preference is for the use of hard power tactics. Conversely, when we're talking about soft power, it really is the polar opposite. So we're looking at co-optation and attraction more than coercion. It's about having someone want to do what you want them to do.
Okay.
And it's about using those non-material assets that a state has to change someone's mind, or change a state or another actor's mind. Right. So using your culture, your political policies, different elements of your society, using those to attract other states.
So I'm just going to give you a couple examples, and hopefully I'm right. So hard power would be like the U.S. 7th Fleet in the Pacific, right? A naval fleet.
would be an example of hard power. The use or the threat of use of that fleet, hard power. Soft power, Coca-Cola, right? The power of Coca-Cola that has gone around the world for over a century, and the meaning that that gives to people, and the feeling that they're united with other people on the other side of the planet. And it's not just American product in that it makes money for an American company and for American citizens, but it's the whole identity of an American power. And I don't know if I'm right about this, but that if I'm, say, living in China or Zimbabwe and I'm drinking a Coca-Cola, I might be less prone to be hostile to the United States if I enjoy this drink, because I associate it with that. So I'm getting nods from you. I think I'm right about those two. Here's one though: the NATO alliance, right? Obviously, the Americans within NATO, or Canadians or whomever, can practice hard power and soft power within the alliance or using the alliance. But the alliance itself, is that soft or hard power?
It is a bit of both, because it does provide military security to NATO allies and partners, particularly against Russian aggression or potential Russian aggression. But itself as an alliance does provide a particular image of unity that can bring in that soft power element.
Okay.
And if we are talking about Trump and his interactions at NATO, I think it brings up an excellent point about his forcing of the 2% pledge. So he went to the NATO summit and was very forceful in speaking to NATO allies about that 2% rule of GDP spending on defense. Mm-hmm. And as it stands, there's only 5 countries that are meeting that pledge. But back in 2014 at the Wales Summit, NATO allies did pledge to try to increase to 2% over the next decade. So he also can't appreciate perhaps that defense spending can't automatically increase. There are domestic politics that will take time to allow for countries to increase their spending. But it also shows the importance of soft power, because just because a state is spending 2% of its GDP on defense doesn't mean that they are net security providers to the NATO alliance. A lot of those countries are actually net security consumers.
Right.
And a lot of them have also not contributed militarily to most recent NATO engagements.
So I just want to go to this idea of the 2% of GDP, which has been a big a bugword for Donald Trump, and something that he's tried to achieve with NATO and then says he has achieved, although nothing really has changed. But when it comes to this 2%, I read an article recently, I think it was in The Economist, that was talking about if you artificially boost this number to 2%, say from 1.3%, and just, say we're doing it to 2% effective immediately. The militaries of countries that have that increase will all of a sudden say, well, what are we going to do with all this money? They're going to buy stuff that will be obsolete quite quickly. They're going to all of a sudden have a huge campaign of bringing in new recruits into the armed forces who will soon enough leave the armed forces, that it's actually counterproductive to have such a quick increase of GDP spending over a short period of time, and that it doesn't actually produce the results of building a stronger military, which is actually the result of incremental change over years, if not decades. Would you agree with that assessment?
I would, and perhaps, I'm not sure, but that's what the allies were thinking when back in 2014 they realized this change would need to be, as you said, incremental, something that happens gradually over time to make sure that, like you said, it is sustainable.
Right.
And simply because you're spending 2% of your GDP on defense spending does not mean that that money is, or those material resources are actually going to the NATO alliance.
So why do you think this is happening? I mean, you've talked about the decline of American soft power, the preference on behalf of the president for hard power. Obviously, we can try to understand the enigma that is President Trump and get to the bottom of why he wants these things as an individual, which is often the cause of his decisions. But there are a lot of people around him who support these things. Why do they, as a collective, what is the rationale for this decline in soft power and use of hard power? Do they think that soft power is useless? Do they think that hard power would represent America being great again? What is it?
could have to do with the fact that material power or material capabilities and assets are tangible. It's something that, although there is a bit of disagreement as to what perhaps we should measure and how we should measure it, certainly there's more of an argument for the ease of measuring hard material assets over something like culture and the impact that, like you said, Coca-Cola in another country could potentially have on diplomatic relations with another country. And I think that perhaps he hasn't yet seen or is only starting to see the negative ramifications of solely relying on hard power. Just recently, the EU has decided that it's going to rally together to try to revive the Iran deal. And the EU has mentioned that's something that they will do with or without the support of the US, excuse me. And South Korea similarly has talked about negotiating directly with North Korea for its denuclearization. And so what we're seeing really is that states are bypassing the US, and that might lead to a time where the United States is no longer even invited to sit at the table when it once was the facilitator of a lot of these diplomatic negotiations.
Well, for so long, and probably still in many ways, America was the one indispensable nation, the one nation that you couldn't do without. But more and more nations, even Canada, in terms of trade, are trying to look for avenues to do things without a very unpredictable, volatile, and politically deadlocked power like the United States that just can't seem to get anything done. But when it does get things done, it's doing it in a very aggressive and, at least on the world stage, a counterproductive way. But I have a question about what's happening in the United States, to go specifically to the State Department. So I think this is still true under Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, and now Mike Pompeo, who's the current Secretary of State, that you have an enormous amount of vacancies unfilled, ambassadorships, under secretaries of state, that the Department of State itself, the Foreign Affairs Department of the United States, has been gutted. And with all of these diplomats leaving after the election of President Trump, you have a lot less people able to do things. Is that the reduction of soft power or hard power, or is that something else entirely when we're talking about a country that is suddenly understaffed in terms of diplomacy?
I think it certainly has to do with a reduction in soft power. If these are individuals that have served administration after administration, that diplomatic knowledge and capability, I don't think is something that can be very easily replaced.
Right.
And I think it speaks to the enduring feature that we understand norms to be. And the United States, at least for some, was this beacon of democracy and norms surrounding human rights and free trade. And now that we're seeing this inconsistency on the international stage, where Trump has decided to pull out of the TPP or remove the United States from the Paris Accord, those enduring norms that we saw from the United States we're no longer seeing. And that kind of inconsistency and perhaps the confusion that it generates, I think, is particularly problematic.
So you mentioned the TPP, and earlier we talked about NAFTA. These free trade agreements, a lot of people argue that these are the underpinning of the American global order ever since the end of the Second World War, that NAFTA and the what would have been the TPP, trade agreements with Europe and with allies all around the world, and of course the WTO, the framework for frameworks of trade agreements, that these are the underpinning of American soft power, that these are what allow the Western world to have hegemony over this planet, some would argue. But Donald Trump is obviously starting to, he's trying to or threatening to tear apart these trade agreements and replace them probably with a very strong version of American hard power, or at least that's the idea behind it. How do these trade agreements fit into all of this? I mean, there are some who argue that trade agreements with American allies only came into place as the return of the favor. So in other words, the Americans promised Japan that they would defend them, but in return, Japan would be an American ally and a presence for American forces in the Pacific. And in return, the Americans would open up the market to Japan, which would be a benefit to the Americans because it was reciprocal. But now all of these alliances have all of these different trade agreements, and Donald Trump's people have argued that they're not to the Americans' benefit anymore, that they're just giving away everything to the rest of the world. For Canadians, that's absurd. For Canadians, we benefit from that trade agreement with the United States, but it seems like they benefit even more than we do, or at least the benefit is dispersed and equal, or as it is intended to be. But I guess my question is what is when it comes to the traditional version of projecting power, how do trade agreements help that? Like, how do they functionally help project American soft and even hard power?
I think they are a good illustration of the combined use of hard and soft power. And as Nye would note, it's smart power. So a state doesn't necessarily have to use one strategy over the other. The combined use of hard and soft power is known as smart power. And the problem with only relying on hard power is you're coercing someone into doing something.
Right.
And that goes back to this idea of winning friends, where to have enduring support, I think soft power is that factor. And by doing away with that reciprocal favor element, that I think will continue to erode relations.
Is it just about the favor, though, or do these trade agreements actually provide avenues for the projection and execution of power, of diplomatic and political power?
I would say that they absolutely do. Yes.
So how does that happen? So in other words, if I'm the United States and I have a trade agreement with Japan, how does that agreement allow me to get things done, to coerce or persuade Japan to do things that I would want them to do?
I think it's not necessarily just looking at trade agreements. I think it's looking at the bigger picture of larger relations between countries, whether it's bilateral or multilateral. It's not looking at the fact that two countries might be involved in a trade agreement together. It's everything else that they're also involved in.
Right.
The fact that they're sitting together at the United Nations, things like that. I think it's that combined amount of interaction diplomatically that is particularly pertinent.
So it's a piece of the puzzle. It's a part of the relationship.
Yes, there you go. That's what I would say.
Well, it's interesting to me though, because I mean, if obviously Donald Trump is someone who would see trade agreements as not only pieces of the puzzle, but chits to be negotiated with or over, right? So if I'm sitting at a table, again, the United States and Japan sitting at a table, and they have a trade agreement, Donald Trump sees that trade agreement as something to be negotiated, something to be used as leverage to achieve something. I don't know what he would be wanting to achieve with Japan, maybe to have Japan help him broker a peace with North Korea, which would be a major political victory for him. And maybe he could say, well, if you don't help me with this, I'm going to pull out of the trade agreement, which I know would be hurtful to me too, because American businesses and citizens would lose out from such a move, but it would be more harmful to you, and I'm willing to go the distance to get what I want. Now, that's a very very simple, narrow view of what a trade agreement can function as. But you're saying that it forms a piece of the larger relationship. And I guess if you have a trade agreement between two countries, that means that more and more people between those two countries are connected, not on the government level, but between businesses and tourism and citizens who know other people between those two countries. That kind of mesh creates a sort of soft power, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And I think it speaks to the concepts of relative and absolute gains. I think for Trump, his focus is on relative gains. It's the idea that the international community is a zero-sum environment. So my benefit necessarily is your loss.
Okay.
Conversely, if we're thinking about absolute gains, certainly one country can have more than another, but they can both have
the benefit.
Right. And it is a positive sum environment. So I think perhaps I don't know, but if he's thinking from a relative gains perspective, that could be why his approach is what it is.
So you had an article that was in the Conversation that was reprinted in the National Post about the erosion of American, I think it was the erosion of American diplomacy.
Yes.
Do you think that it's not just American diplomacy that's being eroded, but do you think other countries are following suit or have maybe even paved the way for this erosion of American diplomacy?
I think what we're seeing now is that the erosion of American diplomacy is a concern for the international community because the United States was, let's say, at the top of the food chain. It was, as I mentioned, that beacon of democracy for so many people or so many countries. And for it to be removing itself both directly and indirectly from that particular spotlight, I think other countries perhaps are now scrambling to know how to act.
Right.
I think with the United States, it served as a way for people to continue and states to continue talking about this liberal world order. It was part of the creation of the system that we live in today. Mm-hmm. And the United States did not typically shy away from discussing human rights, for example. And I think under the Trump administration now, it seems like human rights are taboo and not something to be discussed, whether it's with Putin, whether it was with Kim Jong-un, even the fact that the United States chose to not necessarily come to Canada's aid in what is known as the Canada-Saudi spat is, I think, illustrating that perhaps that leader is no longer there, and therefore maybe we won't be talking about these issues such as human rights. And
right. Why do you think that is? Why do you think the Americans have ceded the ground on the human rights conversation? Is it just because they feel, or the people around Trump feel, that there's just nothing to be gained? That they feel, well, why are we focusing so much energy on these very, again, soft issues that are not really quantifiable when we could be just negotiating at hard tables to get real outcomes that we can then say we delivered for the people? Is it a calculation like that, or is there something more philosophical going on? Do they actually believe that these things are not worth fighting for? I mean, I know I'm asking you to read their minds and tell me what they think, but what are they signaling? Like, why do you think they're doing this?
I think perhaps they don't know the ramifications, or the Trump administration is unaware of what that means.
Right.
I think, as I mentioned, the use of hard power, certainly you get what you want, but is that sustainable? Right. In terms of soft power, if you're co-opting someone, you're given legitimacy. If someone buys into what you're purporting, then you have that support and you have that authority to act. And therefore, when you do act autonomously, you have status and influence to back that up. But if you're simply doing something and forcing someone to do something, that support is no longer there. And I think not acknowledging what that erosion will do to the hierarchy within the international system is particularly concerning. I think I conceptualize the hierarchy as certainly hard power, and I don't mean to degrade hard power in any way. I think it does still have quite a presence within international politics, but it's only a piece of the puzzle. And so I consider hard power to be that factor that allows us to order states within particular clusters. So you hear about superpowers or global powers kind of at the top of the food chain, let's say, and middle powers and secondary powers such as Canada within the middle. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have these smaller states or smaller powers. And I think hard power allows us to categorize states within these larger groups. But I think within those particular groups, soft power is what matters. And it's what allows that hierarchy within those larger groups to shift.
Right.
And so I don't think the United States is going to fall from the superpower category to the small power category. It simply cannot, given its geography and military capabilities. I don't purport that, but certainly within that hard power category, it could fall from the ranks. And certainly there is research to suggest that U.S. soft power has declined. The question is, what does that mean?
Right. Well, and if you're looking at something as, like if you're just looking at a raw calculation, then it's only a matter of time before China, the rising power, if we're talking about the Thucydides trap, right? And we're talking about China, the rising power, and America, the incumbent power. Well, it's only a matter of time before China can match and then exceed the number of aircraft carriers, the number of nuclear weapons, the number of whatever you want to put on the table. It's a much bigger country with a lot more prospects for building in the future. The one thing that the Americans had on their side for a long time that I think you're arguing they're either giving up or they're losing quite quickly is soft power. Now, I don't think that China has the kind of soft power yet that the Americans ever did, but it seems that they recognize it. One thing that the Chinese government is doing is in their outreach to Africa, to countries all over Africa, they're building institutes to teach Chinese as a language, to teach Chinese culture, much like the Americans did after the Second World War, to build universities all over the world, to send American professors to work in different countries, and to take students from all over the world to be educated in the United States, including Chinese students. The Chinese learned from that, and they're now trying to practice the same thing. And it's only a matter of time before, if I'm 4 years old, living in Tanzania, by the time I'm an adult, I'm going to have way more Chinese influence in my life than I will American. I might even drink a Chinese soft drink as opposed to Coca-Cola. And I'm going to, whether I'm working in a market or I'm working in the highest parts of the Tanzanian government, I'm going to want to support I'm going to want to support Chinese power. And I remember I was in Tanzania a few years ago, and people were telling me that the Chinese were everywhere, building roads, they were building railways, they were very present, investing in businesses, mining, things like that. But they preferred the Americans. The Tanzanians preferred Americans to be their partners in everything. And I asked why, and they just said, well, they're kinder, they're more like us, the language is the same, they just related more. All of that stuff means nothing, because in one generation, they could be saying the exact same thing about Chinese businessmen, Chinese politicians who are over here building roads and influencing the country. And this strength of influence that you're talking about with soft power is something that can change. And you're right. Yeah, you can't overthrow in a couple of days the American hegemony over the world. The military is just far too strong, but it's only a matter of time before one flips over the other. And I think we're watching a dangerous game be played. And it sounds like every time the Trump government or anybody who is following in the footsteps achieves a victory purely through coercion or the threat of hard power, that it's a Pyrrhic victory. Because once that is achieved, then they can't do it again and again and again. Because they haven't actually won the hearts and minds. They haven't persuaded anybody. And it's only a matter of time before the person on the other side who got shafted in the deal wants something back. And you create a whole world filled with people who want vengeance. Well, it's only a matter of time again before things change. Do you think that the world is becoming more dangerous because of the erosion of American soft power?
I think perhaps from as I mentioned, human rights perspective, if human rights is taboo, then that could be particularly dangerous. I think you're absolutely right in terms of the Trump administration solely focusing on hard power and in a way giving that status or that position away, given they are not focusing on these other crucial elements. Certainly, I think China does have a long way to go, but as you said, it seems like China is taking a page out of the United States' book and realizing what soft power can actually get you. And certainly, China has its own political, economic, and social obstacles that it will need to overcome, but it seems as though it's trying to overcome them or at least project that image to the international community. Right.
Well, sorry to interrupt, but it seems like one of the most dangerous things that I'm seeing in the rise of China is not necessarily the geopolitical change that entails, right? That you're going to have another rising power, an incumbent power, military strength on both sides, and one's trying to push the other one out of its nearby oceans and the islands that the Chinese are building in the Pacific. I'm thinking more that the Chinese government is presenting an alternative, almost like the domino theory of communism in the 1950s, right? That there's this idea of the Chinese state that is working pretty well. That the contract that the Chinese citizen is apparently forming with the government is that I agree as the citizen not to question you. You provide prosperity to me, right? The contract in the American or Western state is you give me my rights and freedoms, and I will do my best to succeed as an individual, right? But the Chinese model is the state will provide you prosperity if you just shut up and do what you're told. Unfortunately, that model looks like it's working. There's a lot of countries in the world and people in the world who are looking at that model and saying, I might rather have that than the American model of chaos and deadlock and nothing getting done. And people like Donald Trump being the leader. I might prefer Xi Jinping's China, and I might prefer the social credit experiment on social media. I might actually prefer that to have prosperity, because in the end, I would rather have a roof over my head than the right for freedom of expression. Do you think that the model that China is, I guess, presenting to the world is a threat to the American one?
I think it certainly is, but I think the United States is also doing itself a disservice because it used to advance itself, as I said, as this beacon of democracy, and yet after now we know that Russia has definitively meddled in the 2016 presidential election. This benign response from the U.S. government is particularly problematic. And you can't give off this impression of being a leader and flip-flop between approaches. I think that's where we run into danger.
Right.
And not only is China presenting that sort of inconsistency or trying to hide that inconsistency, but so too is the US, with conflicting foreign policies, with divisions within and between political parties. Mm-hmm. And that is very transparent. And that will certainly be to the detriment of the U.S. So I think part of it may be China attracting other countries, but part of it might be the U.S. turning people off.
Do you think that we talk a lot about inconsistency, right? Do you think that is just what democracy is? You're going to have one leader, and then 4 years later, you're going to have another leader. Is that just going to happen in a democracy? You're going to have this change between leaders, whereas in a country like Russia or China, that just doesn't happen. Do you think that inconsistency is something that is both a feature and a bug of a democracy?
I think that there's a difference between variability and inconsistency. So when I'm thinking of inconsistency, I'm thinking of, well, why did Trump feel like the denuclearization of North Korea was an incredibly pressing matter, and North Korea needed to denuclearize, in his mind, immediately? And after reports come out that, well, North Korea has not halted its nuclear program, he changed his tune a bit and suggested that there was really no time limit and North Korea could take its time on denuclearizing, and such a process would be lengthy. That's the kind of inconsistency that I think is concerning, more so than it's a Democratic government and now it's a Republican government. Right. Certainly that can provide a whole host of issues, but
you're talking about the inconsistency of the leader, of the one person who is inconsistent in his approach to foreign relations.
Absolutely. Right. And to speak about the nuclear threat again, if denuclearization is so important, why focus solely on North Korea? Why completely walk away from the Iran deal? Mm-hmm. If denuclearization is a pillar of international security.
Right. Right. Well, clearly it's not a pillar of any. I think that Trump is the kind of leader, and the Trump conversation gets, quite old quite fast when we start talking about the person, right? And what he's trying to do personally, like who he is, what he's trying to do, what's behind his head. And so I try to avoid it, and I try to talk about the effects. I try to think about the people who are around him and what they're arguing for and what they're benefiting from. Cui bono, who benefits? Who benefits from Donald Trump being inconsistent? Other than, say, Vladimir Putin in Russia. There must be people on Trump's team, on Trump's side in the United States who are benefiting from his presidency. The Republican Party, for example, benefits greatly from Donald Trump, partly because he doesn't care what they put forward. Essentially, the deal that the Republicans have made with Trump is, we're going to put a bunch of legislation on your desk and you're going to sign all of it. And in return, we are going to let you be president and be a complete chaotic mess. And they've had to swallow that because they know, and Paul Ryan knew this as Speaker of the House before he decided to resign, that he could pretty much put anything forward to Donald Trump because Donald Trump was agnostic about his opinions on most things, on most legislation. So we talk about having a pillar. I don't think there is any pillar. I think you're right. I think when it comes to denuclearization, for Donald Trump, that's not a pillar of international relations. That's just something that he can win on in North Korea, or something he thought he could win on when everybody thought there's no way. And to the moment, they're being proved right. There is no way he can get a victory there. I mean, talking about classic geopolitics, there is no reason why Kim Jong-un in North Korea would give up his nuclear weapons for some nebulous pledge. It doesn't make any sense. And in fact, it's been proven to be a stupid idea, for example, with Gaddafi, who gave up his nuclear weapons, and then look what happened to him in 2011 while the world community watched and no one protected him. I think that there's just really for any logical actor, Kim Jong-un would not make any, he can make as many deals as he likes, but he's not going to give up his nuclear weapons just because people want him to. Yeah. But are we on the right page here? Are we talking about the right things? Or like when we talk about Donald Trump and inconsistency, or maybe are we looking at bigger forces too? Like, what are the bigger forces at play here? Like the larger historical trends that are at play at this moment in time. Donald Trump, when he's gone and dusted 50 years from now, we may look at him as an aberration of history, but we're also going to look at the forces at play that shaped and changed the world at this time. If we can, what are those larger forces that are shaping hard power and soft power and the erosion of American diplomacy?
Right. And I think one of those core features is the question of how do power transitions occur? And is that something that has happened historically in a particular way that we will no longer see because of all of the societal changes that we've experienced? A lot of international relations theory has pointed to the fact that war is that preemptive and post factor that elicits or is the result of a power transition. Is that something that we will see? Will there be some sort of military war between the US and China, and the challenger of China will come out victorious and take that position as the sole world superpower? So is that perhaps what you're trying to get at? Will we see history repeating itself in terms of how larger changes within the international community will happen?
It could be. If we're talking about the erosion of American diplomacy, there's an easy proximate answer to that, which is Donald Trump. Donald Trump has not seen the value in soft power. He's pulled back diplomats. He has not had someone in the State Department to hire new people who will fill in the top roles because of all of these people who have left. He doesn't care about human rights. There's all of this stuff that are the proximate causes. But again, in 50 years' time, we're going to look back at this and say, why did the Center for World Diplomacy, the United States State Department, why did American soft power decline at this period in time in 2018 or circa 2018? Are we going to say, well, Donald Trump decided this? I think we're probably going to say 50 years from now, these were the forces at play. You had a declining American economy relative to the rising Chinese economy. You have maybe even a declining American democracy, of which Donald Trump is not the cause, but the symptom. Perhaps Donald Trump was not, really has nothing else to do with the decline of Western democracy and liberal democracy for that matter, but to be the effect of it. But to kind of, well, this is what you get when you have a declining democracy. You get someone like Donald Trump, and then you're going to get worse and worse and worse. So the decline of American soft power and diplomacy, if we try to, I know we can't do this and look back 50 years from now because we're not 50 years from now. But if we were to imagine it, I think we would have to ask questions about the deeper forces at play, the larger forces at play. And I think you're right. I think power transition must be one of them. I mean, human relations throughout written history have been about the transition and translation of power between peoples, between countries, between cultures. And if we're looking at it from that, then what are the power transitions currently taking place? I mean, China's the obvious one. You have the greatest migration in human history happening right now in China as people move from the countryside to the cities. It's a huge cauldron of growth and dynamism. But you also have, say, Europe. I mean, what's the power transition that's happening right now in Europe between Russia on one side, the United States withdrawing on the other? You have, obviously, populist nationalists emerging in countries that we thought were done with. We thought they were gone. I mean, what are the other power transitions taking place in your mind today?
I think that really boils down to the question of, like you said, once Trump is no longer president, what are we left with? And the question is, I think, how far can American exceptionalism go? Talking about all of this inconsistency within the United States, but contrasting that to all of the inconsistency that the rising power, let's say, of China is also illustrating. How do you balance those two?
Right.
And if, let's say, Trump wakes up tomorrow and says, oh, never mind, I completely support NATO, I love NAFTA, I'm completely behind the United Nations, let me remove all of my tariffs, will the U.S. bounce back? Will it then remain in that same position, or is it something that it will have to build back up? And if that soft power capability is no longer there, then it seems like the playing field between those two top competing powers, that competition seems like it's a bit slimmer.
Do you, I mean, we when we talk about soft power and hard power, do you think that what the situation is now can be recovered from by the United States, or are they already on the losing scale, right? Do you think that they can recover from this massive erosion in soft power and this, new emphasis on hard power? Can they recover from this, or is this just the way it's going to be?
Yeah, I think that is the $1,000,000 question that I've tried to think about quite a bit. And to me, if you're seeing the EU, for example, say, we're going to try and get back the Iran deal, and that's with or without the United States, that shows that erosion of soft power is having tangible impacts on the United States. And it depends on how far this administration, I think, will go for us to see how quickly it can bounce back.
Right. We're talking about the whole thing about soft power is that it's something that is difficult, if not impossible, to quantify. You can't count up. You can count up the number of aircraft carriers and missiles stored on destroyers, but you really can't count the number of people who drink Coca-Cola and imagine the American lifestyle and therefore would be prone to defend it were it under attack in their own country, right? You can't quantify these things. And therefore they're hard to understand, and therefore they're hard to sell in a political environment when you need to show that you've had a victory and that you're achieving things. It's easy to say, I built an aircraft carrier. Frank, I mean, it might be really hard to do, but it's quite easy to announce. Whereas soft power, frankly, is not, it's very difficult to understand. But, allowing businesses to produce products that represent your country is not that complicated for a government to allow, if you're going to go back to traditional economics or neoclassical economics. But there's one thing you just mentioned a few minutes ago was the United Nations. and this is something we haven't talked about yet, but I'm really curious to know your thoughts on how the UN fits into all this. I mean, it's an institution that for a long time now has been denigrated by people all over the world as ineffective and useless and a waste of money, but obviously is the one place that the whole world can get together and talk. And what could be more important than talking, especially if we still think that diplomacy has value and soft power has value. But even though Donald Trump really has no time for the UN, and the Americans often have no time for the UN, what value does this organization serve in this world of an eroding American power?
Mm-hmm. I think the UN has historically been known as or seen as a reflection of liberal democratic values. And to go back to the competition between the US and China, competition suggests that there's some sort of defining difference between parties. And the US always, or tried to always, project this idea of democracy and liberalism. And the concern perhaps now is there really a contrast between these two states?
Right.
If you're looking at China and Project Dragonfly, where Google perhaps might be working with the Chinese government to put that search engine back into China, but with reservations, with limitations, with blocks, is that different from Trump's attempt to try to stifle transparent freedom of speech? So I think that kind of contrast is particularly concerning.
Well, and I think it's also, as much as we don't think that politicians have that much of an effect on our daily lives, as much as we say, well, they're just shuffling through things and creating policies that have nothing to do with me and they're all just trying to get reelected, what a politician says and does, what a world leader says and does has an impact. So if Donald Trump doesn't care about human rights, it's only a matter of time before a lot of other people don't care about human rights as well, whether it's Google or Facebook doing deals to work in China and helping them to, say, build their social credit system or help to oppress the Uyghurs in Western China. Whatever it is, it's easy to understand why, well, I guess it's okay because he says it's okay and he's at the top. And the precedent that sets for not only the successors to the presidency, but to all of the people who are working in business and in government around the world. And the thing that is frankly horrifying to me is the enabling. I mean, you can look at it on a domestic level. So the enabling of white supremacists in the United States by a president who does not disavow white supremacy. There are good people on both sides and stuff like that. But on the international stage, too, you have Erdogan in Turkey. You have Viktor Orban in Hungary. You have people who are essentially now saying openly that they're dictators, that they're illiberal autocrats. And they can say that because, well, look what the American president says and does. And the precedent that sets is not inconsequential. And although it's another classic example of something that's kind of like soft power. I can't quantify how much Donald Trump's words have impact on people in Turkey. I really can't. Or on the president of Turkey, or on Vladimir Putin, or on Angela Merkel. But I can say that it does have an effect. It clearly does, because you can quantify that there is an effect, even if you can't say that causation is correlation. But yeah.
It's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
And so I think the question that you posed earlier about can the U.S. bounce back, the question is, will it need to if the international community is going down a particular trajectory that is almost seeming like such horrific acts are acceptable?
And what is the point? Liberal democracies are founded on the idea that the individual is sovereign in some way, that they're an entity that needs to be protected, and that if you liberate individuals everywhere, the whole country, the whole community will be better off. Whereas the new model that is perhaps emerging is something quite different and scary. And maybe in 50 years we'll say, well, it's evolved into something new. Thesis, antithesis, and the synthesis in the end is, I guess, better. But we'll only think of it as better because that's where we'll be. And I guess, again, one of the forces at play is not just power dynamics, perhaps, but the emergence of a new or a changed ideology. That the ideology of government, the ideology of elections, the ideology of politics, like why I vote and what place I have in society, that those conceptions themselves may be changing. And in 50 years or 100 years, I might be able to look at this moment and say, well, we were in the middle of a change. That's why everything's in flux, because our ideas of government and existence are changing. I know that that's going quite far beyond the ambit of our conversation of soft power and hard power in American diplomacy. But do you think that the role of ideology and the changing of our understanding of our world around us is part of what's going on in all of this?
Perhaps, but I think it can be brought back. So perhaps we might not be looking to a large superpower, or smaller middle powers might not be looking to this large superpower for guidance, but that might mean more agency for these smaller middle powers to coalition together, to create alliances, to counterbalance that power that they might not be okay following.
So last question for you, for not to get too practical, but what does Canada do in the midst of all of this? As the mouse sleeping next to the elephant, as Pierre Trudeau once famously said, what does Canada do faced with this flux of changing ideas, these power transitions taking place, and the erosion of not only our neighbor and our ally and our friend and our brother or sister or whatever we want to call it, but also our umbrella of protection for a long, long time before the Second World War? What do we do as a country in the face of all of this?
I think, given recent events, it's been eye-opening for Canada to realize that the international community is still an environment that requires self-help. And perhaps and to circle back to our discussion about norms and human rights, but perhaps that gives more power to Canada to be consistent with the way that it has always been, always speaking up or out against human rights violations and not wavering in the norms that Canada represents simply because other states might be doing so.
And I guess the risk would be that we get stuck to be the one voice in the corner saying the same thing over and over again. But the potential gain is that we're the one trusted actor on the world stage of our particular power group and our particular geography being right next to the United States, that we're the one country that can say it's been consistent, can say it's built relationships based on human rights and on criticizing those who violate them, that there is a possible gain from that. It's a big risk, though.
It is, but ultimately, what other option does Canada have?
This has been great. Sara, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
All right, that's the show for this week. Thanks so much for tuning in. Remember, as always, you can check out the website, www.wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com for all future and past episodes. And check us out on social media, at Wogo Show, WOEGO, on Twitter, on Facebook, and on Instagram. Check us out, give us a like, give us a rating, and spread the word. And furthermore, please keep the conversation going. Your quote of the week is from the American Secretary of State under President Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, a person who is as much controversial as he was quite intelligent and perceptive of what was going on, both in his time and I think today. Quote, "The American temptation is to believe that foreign policy is a subdivision of psychiatry." Thanks for listening. Hey, just a quick note to let you know that this show was originally broadcast on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, and that you can also catch it every Tuesday on CHMR in St. John's, Newfoundland. Thanks again.